We go. Right. Notably, David disappeared as soon as we recorded. I'm really pleased to see all of you tonight, those who I can see, and I'm glad that you are joining me for what's really one of my favorite topics. I'll explain a little bit about why, a little bit of background before we dive into looking at the sources, as of course we always do. So I think I titled this something like the Communist Kabbalist, is that right? And that's because the particular person of interest is one individual, and a rabbi whom I spent a lot of time studying because I did my master's thesis on this particular guy's. The name is Yehudah Ashlag, and I'll give a little biographical sketch as background before we take a look at the sources. But he's known by many names, as many rabbis are, often by acronyms or nicknames. He's often known as Baal HaSulam, the author of the Sulam, which is a commentary on the Zohar, and probably the most studied commentary on the Zohar. Sulam means ladder. That's what he called his commentary. So often he's called the Baal Sulam, but his name was Yehudah Ashlag. He was born in Poland in 1850s, 1855, if I remember correctly, and was descended from a long line of Hasidic rabbis. But as there's a lot of legends and stories about his life, like many people, even though it wasn't that long ago. But he distinguished himself very much from the Hasidic background from which he came, and he ended up creating one of the more interesting and more dominant interpretations of Kabbalah. So the Kabbalah that we study today, Jewish mysticism as it is today, is almost always about a system that was laid out by a guy named Isaac Luria, you may have heard me talk about, who lived in the 16th century in the town of Sfat, and is known as the Ari, the lion. He basically constructed a whole theology and mysticism and mythology, which became extremely influential in a very short period of time. He was only teaching himself for about 20 months, the Ari, and he died in a plague when he was 38. So the system that he introduced in the 16th century, which we call Lurianic Kabbalah in an academic sense, is since then, the dominant way of understanding Jewish mysticism. It's a kind of semi-Baroque system of complex understandings of very bizarre ideas. Basically, he gave a layer on top of the Zohar that made it a systematic theology, but he didn't really give us enough to have a modern understanding of. So in the more modern period, meaning from like 1750 and on, there have been several people who have attempted to give a new wholesale interpretation to Lurianic Kabbalah. And today there's kind of 3 or 4 different schools of thought about how to understand Lurianic Kabbalah. Ashlag is significant because he's one of the people that creates one of these schools of thought. His interpretation is very psychological. So he understands all of the imagery and symbolism of Luria as being around internal psychological states, which is very interesting because it very much matches into how we think about psychology today. But it's somewhat unexpected, considering that Ashlag himself came from a completely Haredi background and lived his life as a completely Haredi person for the entirety of it. From his birth in the 1850s until his death in around 1947, I think, just after the war, he was living in a Haredi community. He would have wore a long beard, payas, black hat, coat, shtreimel, the whole 9 yards. But despite looking like many of the other Haredi Jews around him, he always had quite unusual ideas. Most of his ideas were not published during his lifetime, or if they were only fragmentary. He had several major works. The one I already mentioned, the Sulam, is a commentary on the Zohar, line by line commentary on the Zohar, which is extremely useful because he also translated the Zohar into Hebrew. Those who have studied Zohar with me will know it's in a kind of bizarre Aramaic, so he made it more accessible to modern Hebrew speakers. He also wrote a long textbook of Kabbalah called Talmud Eser Sfirot, which is a literal textbook. He was very focused on pedagogy, and rather than make Kabbalah something that's easier, it's harder and harder for people to access, he wanted to make it easier. And he did so partially by writing a literal textbook, meaning he introduces a Kabbalistic concept. He then gives you at the end of it a summary of the concepts he discussed, and there's a list of questions which you can write down on your own in a workbook, and then he gives you the answers to the questions that he asked, and there's a vocabulary list at the end of each chapter. It is a genuine modern textbook and a completely unprecedented and completely unique endeavor. In addition to those two big writing projects which he undertook, the third thing that he was very involved with was politics, but in an unusual way. He wrote a series of essays, mostly in the 1930s, about his understanding of Kabbalah and how that informed his understanding of politics. And the result was that he kind of reached a point which is a version of communism, basically, which has very different origins than what you find for communism at the time. He has a lot in common, perhaps, with someone like Leo Tolstoy, the author and also Christian mystic, who had a kind of communistic understanding of Christianity and lived on a commune with a lot of his followers towards the end of his life, whole side of Tolstoy that most people don't know much about. And Ashlag similarly understood that he believed, from a religious point of view, that Jewish mysticism required a certain political approach to the world, which basically results in a kind of what he called altruistic communism, which is a term he coined. And he called it altruistic communism to distinguish it from state communism, as in the Soviet Union. And he includes, and we'll see actually, one of his critiques of the Soviet Union. Now, all of this sounds a bit crazy for a Haredi rabbi who was raised in a Hasidic family and who grew up in Poland to be talking about Soviet policy and communistic debates around different versions of Marxism. Seems very, 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 very strange. And it is somewhat strange. And as a result, he was perceived to be quite a strange person. Famously, just a little anecdote, one of the earliest leader of the state of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, who of course was a socialist, as many of the early Zionists were, used to complain in letters to his friends that there was this crazy rabbi who used to show up at his door in Jerusalem and try and convince him to be more communist. And Ben-Gurion didn't really know what to do about this. This guy in a Strymel and Payas was talking to him about Marxism and how actually kibbutzim needed to be more and more robust and they needed to kind of nationalize the industries and whatever else. And Ben-Gurion was absolutely baffled by this. So the result was that because of his political views and because of his kind of idiosyncratic understanding of Kabbalah, Ashlag mostly lived in obscurity. He moved to the land of Israel in the 1920s. And purposefully did not try and seek a job teaching or as a rabbi. In fact, he was a janitor for many years at a yeshiva in a place in Jerusalem called Givat Shaul. And it was after a couple of years that some of the students there started to notice that the janitor seemed to know an awful lot of stuff about Jewish texts. And someone eventually recognized him from the old country and realized who he was. And after that, he was kind of less able to hide who he was. But he lived in great poverty. He wrote the Sulam commentary page by page because he only had enough money to print one page at a time. And most of the works he wrote weren't printed during his lifetime because he couldn't afford to have them printed. So it's a very complicated and controversial story, his life. He had several students and several children whom, when he died, decided to divide up the works that he had written. And many of them hid or deleted or destroyed the works that were explicitly political because they weren't comfortable with his interest in communism and Marxism. And so many of the stuff that he did write was lost, unfortunately. The works that he left to his sons, they took the very unorthodox approach of dividing up by each taking a page. So they would take one of his manuscripts and one of them would take one page and one would take the next page and one would take the next page, which of course is extremely impractical for scholars trying to actually reconstruct the manuscripts as they are. And there's quite a bit of work going on right now, actually. There's some scholarly interest today in Israel in academic environments in trying to rediscover these different manuscripts, find them, put them back together, and get a better understanding of who Ashlag was. The way that most people know about Ashlag is not through any of the things I've told you about, but actually through the fact that some of his students ended up creating what is now the Kabbalah Center. So the entirety of this movement, this new age culty movement called the Kabbalah Center, which of course is very prevalent in London, are students of his who attempted to make his system of popularizing and making accessible Kabbalistic ideas even more popular and even more accessible. And as a result, went a very different way with it, in the sense that the Kabbalah Center now is rather kind of creepy and a bit of a cult, and actually very consumeristic, right? They charge lots of money for their secret classes, and you can buy a magic red string for 40 quid and a magic bottle of water. All of that Ashlag would have been horrified by. Ashlag, the communist, who hid himself and his ideas from other people, would not be happy to see that his legacy today is mostly very charlatan-y, culty practices which are claimed in his name by the Kabbalah Center. So he's a very interesting and complicated legacy. What's interesting to me, and the reason I did my master's work on him, was actually looking at his own first-person primary source writings around politics, those essays that were written in the 1930s, and trying to get an understanding of how his understanding of Kabbalah affected his understanding of politics. So that's what I want to do today, is just look at a few of those sources and have a discussion around them, all in English, as usual, and try and get a window into this very unusual and surprisingly unorthodox thinker. Any questions about that before we dive in? No? Okay. So I've had to be very judicious around the sources I include. I have a lot of them from spending 3 years digging through all of his manuscripts that I could find and trying to put together a paper on it. And actually, there's two sources here that I want to start with, which are not his own writing. This is him, by the way. People didn't smile in those generations when they took photographs. It's quite a piercing photograph. He based a lot of his ideas, as all rabbis and mystics try and do, on Jewish sources, but often ones that we don't learn or study. So this first source from Vayikra Rabbah, which is the Midrash on Leviticus, is one of the things that he bases a lot of his thinking on. Anyone fancy reading this for us? Little parable. I can't see everyone. Jackie, I see your hand.
Fine. A group of people were traveling on a boat. One of them took a drill and began to drill a hole beneath themselves. Their companion said to them, "What are you doing? Why are you doing this?" The person replied, "What concern is it of yours? I'm not drilling under my own place." They said to the one drilling, "But you will flood the boat for all of us, for us all."
Okay. You want to just explain that to us in different terms?
What do you mean? When you say...
What's the parable here? What's the idea?
Well, the parable is if you drill a hole in a boat under your place, the water's going to come in and drown everybody. Right. So it's all very well stirring things up. But if you stir things up for yourself, you're stirring things up for everybody. Right.
So you can't do something selfish and endanger yourself and say, well, I'm only harming myself, because actually everyone's in the boat together. And how can you imagine that we could extend this to an understanding of society? How could this become a basis of politics?
Well, this is on the basis of do no harm rather than doing good, but something that affects one, it affects them all. And if he did have more sort of communist leanings, then I can understand that what does good for one does good for all, what does bad for one does bad for all, and we should think of the whole rather than the individual. And in Judaism, we work as a community, but maybe he's thinking beyond Judaism, or wouldn't he have done that?
Well, we'll see. Well, he discusses that, actually. What role do Jews play versus the rest of the people of the world? But I think absolutely spot on there.
Isn't it also about responsibility for other people?
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same idea of what you do affects others, but also that you perhaps also have a responsibility to think of other people.
Yeah, absolutely, Debbie, right? There's a real sense of mutual responsibility here in this text, which we don't talk about necessarily as a value, but I think many of us are not surprised to see as a Jewish concept. Janice, what were you going to say?
I heard something the other day, and it was exactly this, but they're talking about the virus. It's exactly the same. If you've got to think about other people, you can't. What's right for you is not necessarily right for everybody else. So you've got to be really considerate.
Yeah, no, there's a very good analogy here to our own world, certainly, because you certainly find people who, you know, they don't choose not to wear a mask or take other precautions. They say, well, I don't mind if I get it. And actually, you have to respond and say, well, that's fine if you don't mind if you get it, but you're actually putting other people in danger and not just yourself. It's not a victimless crime to take such lack of precaution. And he seems to have a similar idea. The Midrash has a similar idea. This is all the way back 3rd, 4th century, this Midrash, in understanding our responsibility for one another and how selfishness, which is something that Ashlag's going to become quite obsessed with, the idea of selfishness, is actually the root of a lot of harm, right? The person who is only worried about themselves versus the other people in the boat. So just keep that in mind as we look at some of this. Yeah, Robin, sorry.
It feels like actually, but that almost capitalist culture is built on selfishness generating good, because it's whether the incentives are aligned, right? So, yeah. In order to by gaining for myself, I work harder, and that's not only of benefit to me; it's of benefit to others, which seems the antithesis of this.
Precisely, yeah. I think that you can see how this leads us away from, or at least towards, a critique of capitalism, because capitalism does condition itself on the idea of what's in kind of Reagan time called trickle-down economics, right? The wealthy benefit everyone because the more they gain, the more that it trickles down, which of course has been proven, or many would say has been proven to not be the case. Okay, so what I have here, this next text, is a summary, a very brief summary from one of Ashlag's students, one of the more reliable, of his approach to philosophy and to mysticism. Any volunteers to read this for us?
I'll go.
Thank you, Lee.
The essence of good in the world. The essence of good in the world, that is, the good inclination and the concepts of purity, holiness, love of others, and all other good attributes, is the will to give. The essence of all evil in the world, that is, the evil inclination, the husks, the other side, egoism, self-love, and all the disgusting attributes like lust, pride, sloth, etc., is the will to take pleasure and happiness for one's own self-interest. Therefore, the basics of serving God are not so complicated as many in the world argue. Rather, there are only two. 1, suppression of the will to take, and 2, acquisition of the will to give. All the other concepts and attributes and natural states, they are all branches or symptoms connected to and emerging from one of these two, the will to take and the will to give.
Okay, thank you, Lee. So we have this philosophical introduction of these concepts, two wills, and everything framed in that sense, not as good and evil per se, but as the desire or will to give and the desire or will to take. This is kind of fundamental to Ashlag's understanding of Kabbalah, because of course he imagines that God is the predominant example of giving. God only gives and never takes, because from whom would God take? Right? God is purely giving. Whereas he imagines that our relationship as humans is one very much of taking, as children are to parents. Like they're very, very dependent on taking what we need for ourselves. And there's nothing wrong with that, he would say. Ashlag discusses the fact that we need to take in order to live. We need to take air to breathe and food to eat and space to build a home on and everything else. But the danger of, and what he believes is all evil, emerges from a immoderation of the will to take. When the will to take becomes more than just what's strictly necessary and becomes beyond that, then it leads to evil. And he says actually in Hebrew at one point many times that there is no evil other than self-love. Right, so he has a very radical and very strong understanding of evil, and he understands evil as being entirely a product of selfishness. David?
Yeah, I was just, I'm obviously reminded of the world. Basically, the whole Torah is love thy neighbor as thyself. Don't do it to others what you wouldn't do to yourself. it's a similar situation. It's give of yourself, and everything else, all the other concepts, all the other mitzvot, and all the other chukim, they just follow on. And it reminds me very much of that. Basically, give of yourself, love thy neighbor.
Right, very good. So what David is referencing, for those who don't know, is a famous story about Rabbi Hillel, who was asked on one foot by a conversion student to summarize the whole Torah, and his explanation was, what you find hateful, don't do to others. The rest is commentary, right? Go and learn. That is a very key text for Rabbinic Judaism, that actually the Torah can be deduced. All the complexities of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy can be deduced ultimately into one statement of don't do to other people what you find bad for yourself, which of course we talk about as the golden rule. It occurs in nearly every culture and society, a similar concept, even if it's never followed in those societies. It is recurrent. Now, there's another text as well, which, David, you're surely aware of, and I'm not sure if others are as well, in which there's a famous debate among two of the early rabbis about what the klal gadol b'Torah is, what the summary, the general concept of the Torah is. And Rabbi Akiva claims that it's ve'afta l'recha kamocha, right? Love your friend or your neighbor as yourself. And Ashlag cites that many times to say Rabbi Akiva is right, to say that the general concept of the Torah is that you should love your neighbor as yourself, and that actually is an undervalued text for us, that we should really hold that up very highly to say that the general theme of the Torah, when we have to deduce it to one single thing, is to love your neighbor as yourself, which is slightly differently phrased than don't do what's hateful to you to others, but a similar concept, obviously. Yeah, Janice.
A little tangent, but it's thing. Does it say anywhere that you have to be comfortable with yourself? Because a lot what's happening in this world is people aren't comfortable with themselves. If they don't know who they are, how can they give to other people if they're not stable themselves? Does that link in to where we are?
Yeah, well,
you have to be, to help others, you need to be quite solid yourself.
Yes, so Ashlag's diagnosis of the modern condition is that we are kind of addicted to the will to take things. We take things from other people, we take more than we need. It's a kind of spiritual consumerism, right, that he's critiquing, that actually we're constantly taking and taking and taking and never satisfied. And his answer is to say that we're taking too much, and we actually need to focus on only taking what's necessary in order to be stable, in order to be happy and well and okay with ourselves, and that we need to be giving everything else. And he imagines really that our role as humans is to be a kind of conduit for God. God does all this giving, and we have to make sure that we continue the giving by only taking what we need and then passing on the rest to others. Right, and there's lots of ways in which this kind of idea is very frequently evoked in our culture, pay it forward and, kind of mutual responsibility and all of these notions. But for him, it's not just an aphorism, right? It is a completely theological notion in which actually the issue with most of people and most of society is that we take too much, and that we're encouraged to take more and more, and that it's actually kind of a poison that is stopping us from being able to access and relate to God. Because, why does it stop us from accessing God? Because things that are similar attract, he tells us. And if God is giving, and we want to connect to God and have a relationship with God, then we have to make ourselves giving as well, because then we are being like God and thus able to be in contact. Which is quite a beautiful and unusual idea, that actually there's a similarity between things that act the same. Debbie?
No, I was just thinking, I read an article, I think it was today, about Michael Sheen, the actor, who's decided that he's now not going to, he's going to use the bulk of his earnings to give to good causes. So basically that idea that he's earned to whatever enough, and he doesn't need to earn any more, so he'll give his earnings elsewhere.
That's a pretty yeah, that's impressive. And it's easy for us to say, well, he's already earned enough, hasn't he? But actually, when you're taking, you don't notice, you don't think, oh, well, this is enough. You always think, oh no, a little bit more and that'll be enough. And for him to stop and go, yep, this is actually enough, I have what I need, I can give everything else, is very unusual.
Yes. Yeah.
It's really nice to hear. It's why it's properly newsworthy.
It was more than that because he actually sold his properties. He's given up what he's already earned as well.
Interesting.
Okay.
And he's
Really
decided
interesting.
what he's going to do is tithe.
Sorry, David?
He's going to tithe.
Tithe.
Yeah, so he's going to give 10% of everything he owns now earns.
Interesting.
A minimum of that, yeah.
Very biblical.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, lots of questions around charity, obviously, and kind of very material giving factor into this. But it's more than just giving the stuff you have or the money you have. It's really a whole posture of how we relate to other people. Right? For Ashlag, just to say one more thing before we look at the other texts. For Ashlag, there's a rabbinic division that some people might be familiar with, that the mitzvot, the 613 mitzvot, can be divided into two categories. Right? Category 1 is mitzvot ben adam lemakom, mitzvot that apply between people and humans, people and God. That's things like putting on tefillin or praying or observing Shabbat, right? Nobody cares if you put on tefillin in the morning. That's between you and God. So lots of mitzvot are between you and God. And there's other mitzvot which are between you and other people. That's things like giving charity and justice and all of the social mitzvot that come into it. And the rabbis historically divide these into two categories, the interpersonal mitzvot and the mitzvot between God and people. And Ashlag takes a really radical position based on that position of Rabbi Akiva I mentioned earlier, to say not only do you need to focus on the interpersonal, the ones between you and people, but actually by doing the interpersonal, you're also fulfilling the ones that involve your relationship with God, because you are serving the purpose of being like God and giving, and thus you're making yourself closer to God when you're doing things like pursuing justice and giving charity and looking after other people. Now, it sounds, obviously, that takes us in a direction that's a lot similar to perhaps what the Reform movement today in the UK says, right? Which is very focused on Judaism as a social justice movement. But the Reform movement and others get there from a very, very different place, right? They're looking at it and seeing Judaism as a kind of non-religious guide to life, a philosophy. Ashlag's actually getting to a similar place and saying that the main focus of Jewish life is not on what you pray or how often you come to synagogue, but how you treat other people. But he's getting there from this very religious and mystical and very philosophical position of understanding that our obligation to other people reflects an obligation to God as well, which is quite surprising. Yeah, Robin.
So what does he think of if you're talking about the two mitzvot, the two types of mitzvot, what's his interpretation of, is it that people are taking from God as well? Is that part of the evil, is taking from God?
Yes, to a certain extent. I think that the notion, the way that I tend to imagine it, the way that he discusses it, is kind of like a electrical circuit, right? There's a certain amount of energy that's being put into the system by God, let's say, who's kind of, purely giving and giving and giving. And if we, as the next stage along the circuit, kind of just take in that energy, but don't actually open the circuit and pass it somewhere else, then it doesn't work. It misfires. The system doesn't light up. But actually what we need to do is make ourselves transparent in some way so that it passes through us. So we take from God's giving, but actually we take only what we need and the rest passes on somewhere else and continues to pass on. So the aim is to create that movement of making ourselves not a barrier in this process of giving, but actually somewhat transparent. And he talks a lot about transparency and opacity, right? Concepts that, of course, we think about with light, whether something is transparent or opaque. And he talks about self-love and selfishness as mesh, like you're putting successive layers of mesh in between you and God, so it's harder and harder and harder for the light to get through. And by being generous and giving, you're actually removing those layers and allowing the light to pass through. You're still benefiting. It's not about asceticism, right? It's not about denying yourself the basics of life or going out into a cave or not taking any money or living in poverty. It's not at all about that. It's about actually allowing the benefits that you receive to not end with you, but to move on and carry forward, pay it forward, right? But in a very philosophical and spiritual way, more than just a purely ethical or moral way. Which is not usually how we think about such things, right? If you think about it, in some way, it's an expression of gratitude. If you look at what you have and you go, I'm so grateful that this was given to me, and your first response is, now how can I give it to someone else? Then you're thinking in the way that he'd suggest you do. If you look at what you have and go, I'm so grateful that this has been given to me, thanks God, high five, and that's the end of the story, then actually you've completely failed the religious test. And he looks around at other religious people and thinks that's the problem. As religious people are saying their blessings, thanking God for what they have, thanks for all this, parnasah, all this income, all this benefit, but they're stopping there. They're blocking up the flow rather than actually thinking, how can I continue to be like God and continue to keep giving it forward and passing it on? So you can see perhaps how we're moving, or how we can understand that he jumps and goes, yeah, we should be communists, right? Because it's a pretty small step from thinking that the main goal of life spiritually is to try and take only what you need and give to others who need what you don't need, to think, yeah, Marx was onto something, right? Each according to his abilities, each according to his needs. The idea that actually it would balance itself out was something that he found very appealing. So let's look at some of those quotes from, these are mostly quotes from one essay he wrote called Matan Torah, which is the giving of the Torah, in which he tries to lay out some of the idea of how he thinks Judaism suggests this kind of philosophical and political approach to the world. Anyone want to read this first one for us from chapter 20? Janice, was that a volunteer?
The role of the people of Israel towards the whole world resembles the role of our ancestors towards the people of Israel. That is, just as the merit of our ancestors sustained us in our development and our refinement until we were worthy of receiving the Torah. Similarly, it was incumbent on the nation of Israel, by being occupied with the Torah and the commandments for their own sake, to prepare themselves and the people of the whole world until they advance and undertake this external labor of loving others, which is a ladder to the ultimate purpose of creation, that is the fusion with God. That's rather nice, that.
Yeah, so what is it? So it's lovely language. I'm realizing there's a few typos, but it's lovely language. But what is he saying basically? Why do we keep the Torah? What does it do? And who are we for keeping the Torah?
It sort of prepares us in some ways to lay the foundation so we can help others, I think.
Good, right? The Torah is conditioning us to be giving in some sense, right? That actually it's not only helping us to live a better life, but it's helping us to be practice this posture of giving. What else is here though? What else do people see in this? Yeah, Jackie.
What I was thinking was that we use the names of patriarchs and matriarchs in order to remind God and ourselves that, you did this for them, do it for us and help us. And what this seems to be saying is that the nation of Israel, whatever we call the nation of Israel, needs to do the same with the Torah to help Israel then move forward into so it's the Torah gives Israel its merit for then passing it on to whatever comes next and to the world, I suppose.
Right, very good. To the people of the whole world is one of the key elements there, right? So you absolutely, right, very good about the merit of our ancestors. We evoke that to say, yes, you did this good thing, do it for us now. And you're absolutely right. He's drawing an analogy to say that we do the same thing to some extent for other people. Right? By us observing the Torah and fulfilling the commandments, we are doing for the rest of the world the same thing that the God can look at us and go, oh, on the merit of the fact that all of these people are selflessly observing the Torah, then more good can happen for the world as a whole. Does anyone know what this sounds like in terms of political theory? Anyone who studied Marx?
Sorry, Adam, on a slightly different point, I find this quite, well, not strong, I'm not sure what the word is. I mean, I see the Hasidic community as very much sort of cutting themselves off and not necessarily being part of helping other people in the world. So it's sort of, I like the sentiment. I think the ideas behind it are really good, but it seems odd to me to come from someone in a community that actually doesn't really have much contact with the rest of the world.
Really good, yeah. And there's a reason why he wasn't fully embraced by his own community, and kind of ended up quite isolated and idiosyncratic. And it's partially because there is a value of isolation in some of those texts in the Haredi world, of actually, no, we're special and different and we do our own thing and everyone else can, piss off. He's saying, actually, no, we do what we do on behalf of everyone else. We do what we do the Torah, in order to benefit the whole world, which is a very unusual approach in especially a Haredi context, right? If I gave this to you out of context, didn't explain what it is, you might guess this is written by some modern progressive rabbi who is trying to justify how Judaism actually is a social justice project that benefits the whole world. You wouldn't expect this is written by him. And that's what's so interesting. And it again is about God. It's about the fact that we achieve our connection and fusion with God, he uses that word, by doing things on behalf of the whole world selflessly. Now, in Marxism, one of the political debates that was taking place around the same time he was writing this, based on the Russian Revolution, was a question of the role of the party versus the people, right? So the Communist Party was not meant to be a party. It was meant to act as a vanguard, they called it the Vanguard Party, on behalf of the people as a whole. It really wasn't meant to be this kind of upper elite echelon of bureaucrats, which it transformed into in the Soviet Union. The idea was that there'd have to temporarily be a class of intellectuals and well-educated people who would form a party to be the benefactors of the people as a whole, the proletariat. Right, and so the party was the vanguard of the proletariat. They acted on behalf of the people as a whole. And you can see how he's thinking the same way about Israel versus the rest of the world, that actually we are the vanguard. Everyone is going to move towards this position, but we do the action first in order to benefit everyone. We are the representatives in some way, and the elite who are leading the charge of this transition into being more giving. Yeah, Robin.
I was going to ask a related question, actually. So it's how the concept of leadership fits in with all of this. And you could read that as us doing it as a vanguard. You could also see it as us sort of teaching through example, by saying, look, this is a way to live. And then you spread that way of living. And when people realize the benefits of it, and then it sort of filters out through the world.
Yeah.
And that's quite a different concept of leadership from, I think, the way leadership is seen in a lot of Western society, I guess. I don't really know enough about the concept of leadership generally, but
it's a really interesting question, and I think that you're definitely right that this idea is about modeling behavior. Is a ideal, which is not something we usually value so much in terms of what a leader does relative to the people they're leading. And it does reflect that Marxist view of the party versus the people. Keep in mind, one of the first things that most of the communist parties did during the first half of the 20th century was set up workers' education. But a huge part of what the parties did was educate workers, teach them both about politics and about what they saw as the political struggle, but also about general aspects of how to improve their life. And they understood that part of the role of the party was not just to gain power, but actually to benefit the workers and to educate them. Now, of course, I'm not foolish, and I'm aware of how sideways this all went. Right? And the party ended up doing exactly the opposite of what they claimed to do, and seeking only to gain power for themselves, and then becoming a new generation of bureaucrats and czars. But there was a time in which this was the goal, and perhaps Ashlag is tapping into that more idealistic understanding of leadership. And he sees the relationship between Israel and the world kind of like the relationship between the Communist Party and the proletariat. And he's going to say a little bit more about it in the next section. So let's read this next part, a few chapters further on from chapter 23. Anyone fancy reading this for us? Maybe who hasn't? Robin? Maybe since you just, yeah?
This is certain, and there is no disagreement about it, that the issue of the ultimate purpose of creation is incumbent on all of humankind together, all nations and races with no essential difference whatsoever. Nevertheless, because of humanity's descent to the lowest levels of self-love, which rules humankind limitlessly, there was no path of negotiating with them or explaining to them that they should choose to take it upon themselves to quit their narrow framework in favor of the expansive world of love for others. That is, except for the nation of Israel, since they had been subjected to the brutal rule of Egypt for 400 years with great and terrible suffering. The suffering and its consequent purification of our ancestors gave them an advantage over other people.
Right. What's he saying here again about leadership and about our role versus everyone else? Who can summarize?
I'm just really surprised. Am I unmuted now, by the way?
Yeah, you are, yeah.
You know, here is a man, I know, like Debbie said, who lives in a Hasidic community, and all nations and races with no essential difference whatsoever.
Yeah.
To be able to do that and say that, he had to keep it secret because that would be heresy.
Mm.
I
Well,
mean, you know,
he's
Jonathan Sachs had to back out when he said that there was more than one path up the mountain or whatever, or, you know,
Yeah.
truths and not truth. And he had to keep it hidden. And it sounds like he would have written this bit before the Shoah, because he doesn't include the Shoah in the suffering.
very good. Yes, this is 1933 that is published. He does write a little bit after and during the Holocaust, in which the tone changes a little bit, but for him it only exacerbates his point to show how selfishness has destroyed a society and kind of evil has ruled. Absolutely, there's a element of this which is quite surprising to us, perhaps, right? He explains that the ultimate purpose of creation is incumbent on everyone together, right? Everyone has the responsibility to transform themselves into being more giving, right? There's no difference between one group and another. The question then is, so what's chosen about the chosen people? How does he understand the role of chosen people for Israel? It's not about superiority, clearly. It's about a different responsibility, and it's something that's given to us by virtue of our suffering, right?
Sorry, that is very Hasidic. That is very much a thing of the Hasidic community, that the part of the raison d'etre, in a way, and I might be exaggerating it, is the whole suffering and who's ill and who's suffering and who do we have to pray for and whose funeral are we going to, and we've, you know, and it's very, and the Shoah, and we suffered and we have to keep Judaism alive, and it's very much in that line, whereas, you know, Christianity has got somebody who saved people from suffering. We don't, you know, so it's like immersed in suffering, immersed in grief, immersed in trauma, immersed in grief.
Yeah. And there's a piece of that here as well, no doubt. But the trauma is for a purpose, right? The result of the trauma is that we are better prepared to break out of the chains of selfishness. Right? Other people can't do it, even though everyone's obligated to. Everyone needs to try and get away from selfishness, but everyone else is stuck. They're all trapped. They're all addicted to selfishness, and they can't get out. But we, because of our history, have the opportunity to break out of it and to lead the charge away from selfishness and kind of graduate on towards a more giving approach to the world. And that's possible because we understand suffering.
That's what Shiloh just said. I think she's just.
Oh, sorry, I missed that in the chat.
She just said exactly that.
Yeah.
And that's also quoting. Right,
very good, right? So explain, David.
You shall love your neighbor, and you should understand your neighbor, and you should, a lot of the rules and mitzvot that we're given, especially the ones of being kind to someone else, is because you were a stranger in the land of Egypt. So be kind to the stranger, be kind to your neighbor, because you were a stranger in Egypt and you suffered.
Yeah, it's because of our experience that we are the chosen people, right? We have been chosen by pain to be the ones who have the opportunity to break out. It's almost, if anyone was a fan of the Matrix movies of a previous generation, right? He almost has this notion that kind of everyone is trapped. All of humanity is trapped in this selfishness, and no one can find a way to break out. But we actually can see through the illusions of it and have a better understanding of what we need to do. And actually, it's because of what's happened to us that we're able to be clear-eyed. And as a result, we have an obligation to lead the way, right? And you can see here how he's reinterpreting the ideas of Isaiah to be a light upon the nations, of what we talk about very commonly. He's giving it a very metaphysical and worldwide aspect.
But he couldn't risk saying this in his lifetime in his community.
Well, he did publish it, but no, I don't think anyone read it, and it was quite a controversial thing.
I bet.
But no, he's not talking. He doesn't mention Marx once. He doesn't mention the Communist Party once.
But he mentions that all of humanity is equal. That yes, the nation of Israel has an even greater obligation to spread goodness and whatever through the world. But the concept of, and I'm just going back to what Debbie was saying, is that, you know, the ultra-Orthodox community has no interest in anybody outside of their community.
Yeah.
It's like they just don't exist.
Yeah, and this is very different in some way, because he understands us as acting on everyone's behalf. Now, one of the key texts for the idea of chosen peoplehood, one of the things that we often evoke when we talk about how Jews are the chosen people, is a quote from the Torah that says, "You shall be a kingdom of priests to me." Right. So in this section now from chapter 27 is him reinterpreting that. Yeah, Robin. Sorry.
Do you think they're saying that we had to suffer in order to be chosen?
Not necessarily. I think that goes a very Christian route with it. I think he's saying that actually we are chosen. We are the ones that God tasked with doing the leadership of this project of being better people, because we understand what it means to suffer. And as a result, that's what made us eligible. Right? It's only after being freed from slavery that we're given the Torah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So we did have to suffer in order to be chosen.
Perhaps, yeah, and there's an argument perhaps about whether that was the design or by accident. But for him, it's purely a justification for why are we the chosen people? What makes us special? It's not that we're better than other people. It's not that we have anything different to do. It's just that we're the first ones to wake up and have a sense of what we need to do. And so we have an opportunity and an obligation to lead on it. Someone want to read these two little passages from chapter 27 here for me? We're moving through his essay in brief little chunks, but you can hopefully see the development of some of these ideas. I should really translate the full essay at some point, and you can see the whole thing. Anyone want to read? David, I don't think you have. Have you? Can I call on people? Come on.
I'm passing.
Sarah?
Even mundane labours such as harvesting and sowing and so forth may be perceived as actual models of the sacrifices made by the priests of the temple. For what difference does it make whether it is a commandment of offering sacrifice to God or a commandment of loving others as yourself? Indeed, someone who harvests their field in order to feed others is similar to someone who stands and offers to sacrifice to God. As you can see, the words "a kingdom of priests" express the entire form of service, the peak of which is loving others as yourself. That is, that we should be a kingdom of priests, for whom God is our inheritance, having no private property. We have to admit, in spite of ourselves, that this is the only possible definition one may come to of kingdom of priests, since you cannot explain it as making sacrifices on the altar, for it wouldn't make sense for the entire nation. If everyone were making sacrifices, who would they give them to? Therefore, the meaning of the term must necessarily be that God is their only inheritance, that they are without any material possessions to themselves, which is the maxim of love others as yourself.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. So we get to a point here where he's giving us a novel interpretation of the phrase Mamlechet Kohanim, a kingdom of priests. What's his take on what this means, and how is it different than what we usually understand?
Priests had no property, they had no land, they had nothing. But they were actually dependent on everyone else bringing stuff to them.
Very good.
And bringing the harvest to them. So because otherwise they didn't eat and they didn't have anything.
Very good.
So, I mean, are they saying us as a kingdom and priest, actually we have to rely on other people to give us stuff?
Mm.
You know, I'm just on that, you know, that in a Hasidic community, the men study, that's what they do, and the women do the work, and they get money from charity or whatever.
It wasn't that way necessarily in his time, and he's not necessarily normative in his own community by any means.
Okay, so this is that the rest, that we should treat the world and other people as if they were the priests. So we are doing the harvesting, we are doing the giving to others, I think, because we're not the priests, because the priests relied on other people to give to them.
They did. So
I'm just sorry. Yeah.
No. I think you're half right, to be honest, which is that you know, the normal understanding of the phrase kingdom of priests is that everyone needs to be holy, everyone needs to be sacred, and that's what's so special about us, is that all of us are sacred, like everyone's a priest. But as he very kind of sensibly points out, it couldn't be that everyone was a priest in a real way, because then who are we sacrificing for on behalf of us? We can't sacrifice on behalf of everyone if everyone's a priest. So he says the only way we can understand it, which of course whenever a rabbi says it's obvious there's only this one meaning, it's because he thinks there's many other meanings. The only way we could possibly understand it, he claims, is that what it means is that we're not meant to have private property, just as the priest didn't have private property. Which of course makes a lot of sense when you're thinking about his understanding of communism in a spiritual sense. It's very obvious to him that of course we should all share everything in common and not have private property or land, because we're a kingdom of priests and priests don't have property. Sarah?
But isn't it also saying that people are as important? It's as important to look after each other. It's as important for God as offering a sacrifice to Him.
Very good. Yes, so the first part is laying out this idea that actually the sacrifices are just one of many ways to approach God, and it's just the same to take care of other people. And this is hinted at before in his understanding that the interpersonal mitzvot are not only the same as the mitzvot between God and people, but actually even better than sometimes the mitzvot between God and people, because they're accessible and they practice the giving that he wants us to do. And so actually this idea that we are practicing the giving more by harvesting your field and feeding others than by sacrificing an animal to God is really quite unusual for us to see, and again sounds very much like a kind of antinomian, modern, reform, progressive way of thinking, is to say, forget the sacrifices, focus on social justice. He's saying it in a similar way, but from a very different point of view, which is that if we only have such limited energy, should we do the mitzvot which are focused on helping other people, or the mitzvot which are between us and God? He's actually saying that we should get out and do the things to help other people, and that's our way of honoring God and respecting God and connecting with God.
Other people are our inheritance, as much as God is our inheritance.
Yeah. And he gets to a very radical place where he actually thinks that our approach to God happens through other people, right? That actually our encounter with other people is our way of accessing God. And it, as a result, is very kind of radical in many senses of the term. So we have several of the key planks of a kind of spiritual communism, even that we've seen in this small survey. We've got an idea of kind of the Vanguard Party. The people of Israel are the ones who are leading the charge of helping to educate the world around the real nature of their obligation, and everyone's eventually going to get there, but we're going to start and then, export the revolution around the world to all the other peoples. We have this notion of actually living in communal ways, of not having private property, and an idea that the best way for us to observe the commandments and how we honor God is actually to do the commandments that honor other people, and that ticks both boxes in some way. So we can start to see, hopefully, how he's actually using very Jewish ideas and basing it on kind of pre-existent discussions in Jewish sources to construct an idea that to him apparently seems obvious. He quite often says, obviously this is the only way to understand it, when he's saying something totally radical compared to everyone else, which is my favorite, right? Is like, you're saying something absolutely bizarre, but you go, of course everyone knows this. No one has ever said that before anywhere, so I don't think everyone knows that. But to him it is obvious that if you look at the Jewish sources, if you look at our tradition, if you look at Kabbalah in particular, and you understand the theological and philosophical aspect of God correctly, that of course you're going to be a communist of some variety of other. Not necessarily the kind of communist that we're familiar with from the history of the 20th century, but a communist in the sense of wanting things to be communal and working on behalf of everyone and observing that maxim of Marx of each according to his needs, each according to his ability. Now, the last thing I wanted to share with you is actually a really interesting little quote here. Ashlag tried to start a Jewish religious communist newspaper in Jerusalem. He only published one edition, which we have. If anyone knows where the others are, please tell me. But there's only one edition which I've ever managed to find, which was the edition published on the 6th of May, 1940. Quite a tense time, I imagine, in the land of Israel. And he called it Ha'umah, which means the nation. And there's several articles in there that he wrote. He wrote all the articles. He wrote to try and kind of sell people, the common people, right, non-religious people, on the idea that actually religion and communism were interlinked. And he gave this amazing little window into his criticism of the Soviet Union here, which I'll just read before we conclude. He says, I must admit that I see the socialistic idea of equal and just division as the truest. Our planet is rich enough to provide for all of us, so why should we fight this tragic war to the death which has been dimming our lives for generations? Let us share among us the labor and its produce equally, and an end to all the troubles. After all, what pleasure do even the millionaires among us derive from their possessions, if not the security of their sustenance for them and for their progeny several generations on? But in a regime of just division, they will also have the same certainty, and even more. Indeed, as truthful as this ideal might be, I do not promise its adherents even a shred of paradise. Quite the contrary, they are guaranteed to have troubles as in hell, as the living proof of Russia has already taught us. However, this does not negate the correctness of this ideal. Its only fault is that to us it is unripe. In other words, our generation is not yet morally ready to accept this government of just and equal division. This is so because we have not had enough time to evolve sufficiently to accept the motto from each according to his skills, to each according to his needs. It's, to me, quite a shocking, kind of very prescient understanding in his time of both the power of the ideal of communism and also the failure of the praxis of communism. Right? He's looking at Stalin's Soviet Union in 1940 and going, yeah, I'm aware that it didn't work out properly, but I still think it's right if it could be applied properly. He demonstrates an understanding of evolution, right, of some sense. He says we're going to evolve to a state at which we are actually able to implement this. He demonstrates understanding of the fact that people are motivated towards capitalism out of the desire to provide for themselves and their families. And actually, if we were able to have a just division of labor and produce, we could do that for everyone. He understands actually that there's an almost environmental aspect to this, that there's enough to provide for everyone. We don't need to all rush to scramble for things, that if we divided it equally and justly, everyone would have what they need. But he also, with some sadness, recognizes that we're not able to do it at the moment, even though we might want to. And it leaves us perhaps in much the same position now, quite a few years later, right? Nearly 100 years later from when he was writing these texts, we're finding perhaps that nothing has changed that dramatically. Although maybe in some way we have moved more towards a position where we're able to actually live out these ideals of justice and equality. I don't know if that's true, but I think he would have hoped, certainly, that now would be the case. I think he would have hoped that Judaism in 2021 was a Judaism that was promoting this kind of political vision of the future as being one of being about responsibility and obligation and about the Jewish people leading the charge. I don't know if he would have been happy with what he finds today. I know he would have been disappointed in what he finds today quoted in his name, and much of the stuff that evokes him as a teacher is far from his value. Again, people selling 40-pound bottles of water that they claim are magic and saying it's because of Ashlag. Pretty sure he wouldn't be psyched about. But I wonder if his critique of communism and its Kabbalist origins would have changed in the time since. So, thank you for joining me for this interesting little window into the interesting guy. He's absolutely fascinating. Any questions that we can leave us with about how to take this forward or think more about this?
I found that last bit a bit depressing, in the sense that the gap between rich and poor, both within countries and, between developed and developing nations, has probably got more rather than less. We may be more aware of it, but I'm not sure that we're necessarily doing very much about it.
It's an interesting question about level of inequality and why our awareness has not led to a change. We are more aware of it than we ever have been, but that hasn't leading to behavioral differences quite yet.
And I was thinking with just the how the vaccine has been passed around, who has vaccines and who doesn't have vaccines.
Definitely a model of how we treat one country or one people acting on behalf of everyone else. We don't necessarily see ourselves as a worldwide community in that sense, or else we would act differently, perhaps.
I was looking at the kibbutz system, which was obviously set up around that time.
Yeah.
And that should have survived, but it's gone more materialistic. It's gone the opposite way in many ways, and which is sad, because it when it started off, it was probably more how he expected it to be.
He was very supportive of the kibbutzim. His only complaint about the kibbutzim is that they were too secular. He wanted to see religious kibbutzim, right? Kibbutzim, which were totally socialist and full of religious Jews, because to him, socialism and religion were the same thing. So I think he was disappointed in the lack of religiousness of the kibbutzim, but he was very supportive of it. He went to Ben-Gurion and tried to convince him to open more of them, which is what baffled him. This frum guy was trying to talk to him about Marx.
I think that's the bit that I find really fascinating, is the idea of sort of spiritual communism being a sort of route towards it's the conduit is the spirituality.
There are B'nai Akiva kibbutzim. There are Orthodox kibbutzim.
Yeah, and there are definitely people who think similarly today. There was a kibbutz that was started in his honor, in his memory, called Or HaGanuz, the Hidden Light, which is full of some really interesting people in Israel. Kind of people who were hippies, I think, in a previous generation, who try and live, at least in that kibbutz, by Ashlag's ideals. But it clearly, if anything, capitalism has gained a stronger hold in the 100 years since the generation that he lived in. Despite the advances of communism and the Russian Revolution and others, it has, the small scale examples like the kibbutzim have been scaled back and have been gradually made more and more market based, and are now profit and private.
He's saying that if we treat everyone equally, there'll be no more wars.
Yeah. Which is a typical communist critique, isn't it? That war is a product of injustice between countries and between people, and that actually wars are conducted between the bourgeoisie of two countries, whereas the proletariat are suffering on both sides, which is why the Soviet Union, during the revolution, pulled out of World War I, very controversial. So, he's definitely kind of evoking many of the things that we'd see in a totally secular discussion around politics, but he's infusing it, which is what's interesting to me, of course, as you said, Robin. He's infusing ideas that are not new, that are very common, certainly in this time period, with a kind of Jewish spirituality that we rarely see. And I think that's what's so important about it, is that it shows us at least there is a way to read Jewish tradition and theology as being in consonance, at least, with a certain kind of political activism. And it seems very foreign and very far away from our time now, but in other senses, it feels very relevant. And I think there's a reason why there's a big interest in studying Ashlag today. As I was doing my research, I found that more and more people were interested in it, and I saw scholarly articles popping up, and there's been a huge amount of work in the last 10 years trying to recover these manuscripts and talk about it in academic salons and kind of elite philosophical circles in Israel. And I wonder if maybe there's a reason why the renaissance of interest in him is happening now. Maybe it is quite relevant for us. Hopefully you found it relevant to take a look at this evening. Communist Kabbalist. David, close us off.
No, I was just thinking that you're mentioning about a couple of ideas, and I'm thinking that communism doesn't actually entertain religion, but here we do have someone within religion trying to entertain communism. And the other thing is, when you said about, communism and wars, well, a lot of people will say that a lot of wars are around religion.
Yeah, it's the other thing we of course didn't really touch on is the way in which there's a critique of religion in communism. Of course, the opiate of the masses, claimed Engels, and he doesn't really respond to that. But he's not alone in trying to forge a religious interpretation of communism. If you're interested in looking at an analog, look at actually Leo Tolstoy's work, not Anna Karenina, but his Christian mysticism. He wrote a little pamphlet called "The Kingdom of God is Within You," which sounds a lot like what Ashlag is saying, but in a Christian context. And he lived it out. He lived in a kind of communal way, in a very kind of hippie style as a Russian peasant for much of the later part of his life. And there was a time where there was a fusion possible between a certain kind of radical socialism and religion. And now those seem very much at odds, as they did to some then, but perhaps they don't always have to be. And for those who are interested in both, perhaps it's a window into how to explore and develop it. So you can tell Sam he may be interested in both, as I know. Thank you guys for joining me tonight. Really lovely to see you. If you're interested to learn more about anything we talked about, let me know. I've certainly got some reading recommendations.